So last week I made a video talking about all the different ways that I think that the Steam Deck has some distinct advantages over the Ally. Now, that's not just because I probably have at least some built-in bias towards the Steam Deck since I've spent way more time with that than the Ally, but I really did just try to take an honest look at the pros and cons of each system and just break down the areas where I thought that the Ally could see some improvement. And in turn, I think it's only fair that I do a follow-up video where I talk about exactly the opposite, where I kind of go over some of the advantages that the Ally has over the Steam Deck. Not because I'm on some mission to instill a sense of fanboyism in anybody or anything like that, but rather I just think it's important to go over the pros and cons of each system so that people can make a decision that best suits their needs and preferences. And just like in this previous video, as I start going through these differences, I'm going to cover the most obvious advantages that the Ally holds over the deck, and then work my way to the least obvious advantages that it holds over the deck. And I don't think it's unfair to go ahead and get this obvious no-brainer out of the way first, and that is that when it comes to raw gaming performance, the Ally definitely comes out on top. Now, I don't think I can say that the Ally mops the floor with the deck in every single scenario, but it definitely wins out visually in nearly every head-to-head. Sure, you can find outliers here and there where you might encounter frame hitching or weird inconsistencies on the Ally that may not appear on the deck, but by and large, every game that I've fired up on the Ally that I've previously fired up on the Steam Deck, especially heavy-hitting AAA titles, run much better on the Ally. And I feel like I go back to this example a lot, but the most obvious one that I can think of, at least recently, is Spider-Man. It always ran passably on the Steam Deck in so much as it was technically possible, but honestly I'd never have chosen to play Spider-Man on the deck start to finish when I could have had a much better experience on something like the PS5. But when it comes to the Ally, Spider-Man looks better, plays smoother, and really just feels like you're getting the full-blown experience in an uncompromised way. Especially if you're playing tethered to a beefy enough backup battery that you can trigger that 30-watt turbo mode. And that's pretty much been the case for every other title that I've thrown at the Ally as well. After testing out dozens of different games on the Ally, many of which I'd already played on the deck, I don't think I've encountered a single title that failed to run or didn't demonstrably run better than what I had on the deck, so if you're after raw power and battery life isn't a concern for you, then the Ally is an absolute beast even without hooking up the external GPU. But aside from raw graphics performance, the Ally is also a lot better at running a lot more games than the Steam Deck is, and with less tinkering to get there. Obviously, the Ally can run Steam just fine in big picture mode and run most of your games natively within Windows without any need of software trickery to make those titles run. But beyond that, it's also a whole lot easier to get games from other marketplaces or sources running on the Ally as well. I've done a few videos here on the channel showing how to get different launchers, marketplaces, or even specific titles to run on the Steam Deck. Sometimes it's sort of smooth, but a lot of the time it takes some trial and error to get it working, and even these non-Steam third-party launchers for platforms like Epic or Battle.net don't run perfectly on the deck. Serviceably, sure, in most cases, but with the Ally running natively on Windows, it has no trouble getting these installed and running smoothly, and you won't have to type in any cumbersome commands or do any workaround trickery just to get Diablo 4 to run on your Ally. And launchers aside, it's also been really nice to finally play games on the Ally that previously I just could not get to run at all on the Steam Deck. Some examples include Obscure, which honestly is probably a pretty apt title for a fairly obscure horror game from circa 2005, I think. And also Onimusha Warlords, which I always had trouble getting to run on the Steam Deck. And overall, it's just better suited to play Windows games being that it's a Windows device, so you're more likely to get a smooth installation and play experience than you would on the Steam Deck. And if a game you really wanted to play just wouldn't run at all on the Steam Deck, or at least not without a fair amount of tinkering to get there, there's a pretty good chance it's going to run just fine on the Ally. And when it comes to the act of actually physically playing games on this device, I have to say it definitely takes the win in terms of comfort and portability, if only barely. I was not initially convinced by the shape of the Ally. The form factor overall is pretty much what I'd expect from a device in this class. You know, it's a screen with buttons on the sides. But I wasn't entirely sold on the physical housing, as it looks so much sharper and more aggressive than the deck's curvier presentation. But having now had it in hand for a little bit over a month, I have to say it's definitely more comfortable for handheld play. Now, I realize this is a pretty subjective point to make. Obviously, not everyone has the same size hands or has the same idea of what comfort means, but what I think is pretty objective is the fact that it is definitely a smaller and lighter device. And while that difference is slight, you will definitely notice the difference, particularly for longer play sessions or depending on how you hold your device when you play. Simply put, I didn't really feel the need to reposition the Ally as much as I did when I played the Steam Deck, and in turn I find myself grabbing it a lot more often to play games on the deck. Not solely because of the comfort, but it's definitely one of those slight advantages that makes it more appealing when I'm in the mood to jump into a game quickly, especially if I'm looking to take it on the go, albeit for a shorter trip. Obviously for a longer trip I would be more inclined to take the deck because of the battery life advantage, but yeah, by and large it is a more comfortable device and definitely easier to take with you if you're going to be out traveling somewhere. Alright, so it's more powerful, has a greater degree of compatibility with both individual titles and marketplaces, and given its dimensions, is a more comfortable system to hold and play games on. And I think those are pretty obvious points for the most part, but these last two were not so obvious to me until I got to spend some more time with the Ally. And the first area where I think I did not realize that I would see a significant difference is in desktop OS navigation and troubleshooting. I know I've said on multiple occasions one of my favorite things about the Steam Deck is that I did not have to mess around with Windows. Despite Windows being the standard against which the vast majority of PC games are created, it's that same versatility that's led to Windows having a variety of issues ever since its first iteration back in the 80s. And that's not a knock against Windows necessarily, that just kind of is what it is when you've got the world's most popular operating system that's deployed across, untold numbers of hardware and software configurations. Bugs are just going to pop up when you try to have an OS that's going to work with everything. Because if Everclear taught me anything, it's that whenever you try to be everything to everyone, you're probably going to have a rough time. Thankfully, Windows is a lot more stable today than it was in, say, the Windows 95 days, but just the same, you're definitely going to run into technical issues, configuration challenges, and crashes on a long enough timeline. But here's the flip side, or I guess the silver lining of the Windows operating system and whatever squirreliness you might have to contend with at certain points, is that because it is such a prolific operating system that's been in place for years and years and has been so synonymous with PC gaming, odds are good that whatever Windows-based problems you might run into on the Ally have likely occurred and already been solved by somebody else either also on the Ally or on a different machine entirely that still has Windows as that common denominator. And in turn, this kind of seems to make troubleshooting things on the Ally a little bit easier than the Steam Deck, again just by virtue of the fact that there are millions of people out there using Windows who have probably solved the problem that you're encountering already and in all likelihood have documented it somewhere on the web. But putting aside troubleshooting problems in the Windows environment on the Ally, as much as it's frustrated me over just decades of using it at this point, that also means that I've had decades to get familiar with how Windows operates, including key components, utilities, and configuration options. If you're having a problem with a device, check out the Device Manager. Need to partition a drive? Go to Disk Management. I don't have to look this stuff up for the most part because Windows has been at the forefront of consumer computing and by extension gaming for years and years at this point. So while the Windows operating system isn't my personal favorite to work with, it is definitely a familiar one. And the Ally only works as well as it does with that much flexibility because it can run Windows natively. No, it's not as reliable as some bespoke operating system that you'd find on something like a PlayStation Vita, but Windows is at least easier to navigate than most consumer operating systems by sheer virtue of familiarity. So yeah, in a nutshell, I guess you would say that Windows is both a blessing and a curse, but hey, the devil you know, right? And I think it's because of that familiarity that doing other things with the Ally besides or in addition to playing games on it is actually really, really great. Considering the Windows environment is always available for you right behind your game rather than needing to reload into a desktop interface like the Steam Deck, certain things are just really effortless on the Ally. Want to fire up Netflix, Spotify, Discord, or literally any other Windows application? Go for it. Want to play a game where you grind up some XP while you watch a movie side by side, or maybe more practically watch a video walkthrough while you get through a difficult part in a game? That is very doable on the Ally. Because despite Windows' occasional frustrations, it's a lot more stable than it used to be, and while I may prefer the stability of a bespoke operating system that only runs games, Windows definitely has its advantages. And having it always at the ready makes the Ally more of a computing Swiss Army knife than the Deck, or at least a more approachable one, because I'm betting the vast majority of Steam Deck owners are not experts on the Linux operating system. I know I'm certainly not. And it's for all of these reasons that even though I adore the Steam Deck, I have come to really love the Ally as well. And it's not really been a situation where I kind of looked at both of these systems and was like, oh, well, the Ally's trash at this, or the Steam Deck can't do this, so it's dead to me. Rather, it's just been this really interesting experience to kind of explore both systems and really take a look at what they bring to the table. And in turn, I've sort of learned to appreciate both systems' pros and cons, and just sort of enjoyed ping-ponging back and forth between the two of them depending on what I need at any given moment. Obviously, for a lot of my channel work, I'm going to be leaning heavily on the Steam Deck, but then when I just have like an hour, hour and a half that I want to kill and I'm not concerned about battery life, the Ally's pretty great to just jump into some Spider-Man real quick. So yeah, to kind of wrap this whole thing up, obviously I have a lot of love for both of these systems, and both have their pros and cons, but these are some of the more obvious or not so obvious ones that I noticed with the Ally that I just didn't anticipate. A lot of them are actually Windows-based, and that really was not something that I was expecting. But hey, what do you think? If you have both systems, do you see anything that I failed to mention here that you think the Ally does better than the Deck? If so, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. As always, thanks so much for your time. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.